Deputy Thomas P. Broughan.
Thanks, Lascan Corla. I'd like to strongly commend my colleague, Deputy Willie Penrose, for using private members' business this week to highlight the appalling decision by the government to cut the national minimum wage from €8.65 an hour to €7.65 under the Financial Emergency Measures in the Public Interest No. 2 bill. The campaign to introduce a national minimum wage, Lascan Corla, in Ireland was a long and difficult struggle that was led by the Labour movement and by the Labour Party. One of the key figures in the campaign for the Irish minimum wage was, of course, Mr Peter Cassells, who prioritised this important campaign during his tenure as ICTU's General Secretary. I was honoured, Lascan Corla, to be involved in the minimum wage campaign, and I was delighted as Labour's then spokesperson on enterprise, trade and employment to support the introduction of the national minimum wage of then £4.40 per hour under the National Minimum Wage Act of 2000. Indeed, over 100 years after, I think, the first country that introduced a minimum wage, which was New Zealand. It introduced it in 1896. As Labour Party spokesperson, I argued strongly at the time, as our motion reiterates tonight, that the existence of a national minimum wage is indeed a statement of core values, providing a threshold of decency under which society agrees that workers' wages should not fall. But it was also clear that since the introduction of the national minimum wage, that it has operated in an effective way and has not been a disincentive to work. However, the appalling proposal to reduce the wage will clearly have the opposite effects from now on. The experience in the US and the UK, for example, has proved that the introduction of a minimum wage is overwhelmingly positive in terms of protecting the pay and conditions of the lowest paid, reducing the cost of social welfare payments and encouraging consumption. And it's also been found that the existence of a minimum wage does not have a negative effect on job protection or creation. Landmark research, indeed, in 2 US states by the economists David Card and Alan Kruger in the 1990s found an increase in the minimum wage did not lead to job losses, and in general they concluded that the existence of minimum wage regulations had negligible negative effects. This research has been supported, of course, by other Nobel-winning economists over the years, such as Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz. In the UK, the impact of the minimum wage has been monitored since its introduction in 1999 by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and various studies by the Low Pay Commission and other bodies have found, again, a very positive impact on minimum wage and minimum wage increases. Yet even in the face of all this evidence to the contrary, the Minister for Finance and his colleagues continue to insist that they are reducing the minimum wage to address our high unemployment rate and falling competitiveness. Enterprise, Trade and Innovation Minister Bat O'Keefe said just 2 weeks ago in a Dáil speech on the IMF EU bailout that, and I quote, "On labour costs, we'll reduce the minimum wage by €1 an hour based on research showing that a reduction in minimum wage would result in an increase in employment in the medium term." There is no such research, actually. And slashing the national minimum wage by €1 an hour and by €40 a week will simply not achieve those objectives. The government, and especially our delusional Environment Minister John Gormley, have also tried to argue that cutting the national minimum wage was forced on us by the European Central Bank, by the IMF and by the European Commission, as the cut in the minimum wage is included as part of the structural reforms to facilitate a so-called adjustment in the labour market in the programme of financial support for Ireland. But this, of course, is clearly untrue. And once again, Minister Gormley was clearly lying, as was cogently pointed out by David Begg in an analysis.
The Deputy can't make the accusation that
he was clearly misleading his colleagues. As was pointed out by David Begg in an analysis of the interview with Mr A.J. Chopra of the IMF in Morning Ireland on 29 November 2010, which clearly showed the proposal to slash the minimum wage came from Minister John Gormley, Minister Brian Lenihan and all their colleagues. Cancorla, in effect, however, we're using this shameful cut in the national minimum wage as a trigger to produce an internal devaluation following the banking guarantee catastrophe of September 2008. This means that the lowest income families and households will have their wages cut and social welfare benefits slashed. The reduction in the national minimum wage is therefore part of a wider ideological policy of this government. Fianna Fáil and the Greens are cutting the minimum wage and targeting the lowest paid workers so that social welfare benefits in turn can be further and further slashed and burnt. I welcome Fine Gael's support for the Labour Party's defence of the minimum wage, which we work so hard to introduce. But Fine Gael also wants to achieve an internal devaluation by crushing the most vulnerable in our society and slashing social welfare rates. Indeed, the identical £3 billion Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael cuts to social welfare and their £6 billion plus austerity packages show that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, Lascan Corla, continue to be the Jedward of Irish politics. Of course, Fine Gael also wants to slash core public services with nearly 50,000 redundancies planned. But if an internal devaluation is the Fianna Fáil Green Fine Gael aim, as Deputy Penrose has outlined, then prices have not dropped to match the decrease in wages and conditions. In fact, in October 2010, it was reported that Irish consumer prices, as measured by the CPI, have risen by 0.7% in the year since October 2009. The CPI for November 2010 was also 0.6% higher than in November 2009. Deputies in this House who do a weekly grocery shop, and I'm one of them, will acknowledge that the cost of food remains relatively high. The CSO also recorded in November 2010, as Deputy Penrose said, that housing, water, electricity, gas and other fuel costs rose by 9.2% from November 2009. Communications rose by nearly 3%, and there were other rises culminating in a 2.4% rise. There were indeed, of course, some decreases in clothing and footwear, alcoholic beverages and tobacco, small increases, but these decreases are dwarfed by the increases in fuel and in housing costs alone. Added to those are the increase in prices for prescribed drugs and medication, house and motor car insurance, and the ongoing high costs of rents, petrol, hairdressers, GP fees, entertainment and leisure services. Rip of Ireland is clearly alive and well, Laskincorla, yet our poorest working families will have €40 a week less to cope with the relentless rising price level. Crucially, this government has made no effort to control or lower prices for basic goods or services, which is what most of the income of low-paid workers is spent on. Why, for example, has it not tackled cartels in the liquid fuel, in the cars, medical, legal services that keep prices artificially high for these goods and services? And why, indeed, are we slashing the minimum wage while actions on those above outrageously sheltered cartels are long-fingered? You won't find them in the four-year plan. You won't find them in 2011. They're down the line, Minister, yet we're prepared to cut the income of the poorest people and let those richest people escape. It's grotesque, however. We should be using the device of an internal devaluation to allow Ireland to stay within the euro area by crucifying citizens living on the minimum wage and social welfare who are bearing the brunt of this so-called adjustment. As my colleague Deputy Roisin Short also eloquently highlighted in this chamber last week, who among us could survive on €297.40 a week minimum wage? How do we expect minimum wage workers to adequately feed and clothe their children when their already low wage has been cut by €40 a week and they have to pay the new universal social charge, one of the most shameful actions of Minister Lenihan's government? There's been no increase, for example, in the minimum wage either since July 2008, and its real value over the period was significantly reduced through the introduction of the 2009 income levy. For most minimum wage workers, a simple trip to the cinema is a non-attainable luxury. As someone said to me just the other day, there'll be little or no change out of €50 after bringing a couple of kids to the cinema and buying a few bags of sweets or an ice cream for those children. But you are prepared to stand over that kind of hypocrisy and madness. The St Vincent de Paul Society has reported that many of the surging calls for assistance to society since January, including up 35% I think across the country and higher in urban areas, 50% in Cork and over 40% in Dublin, those calls have come from low-income and minimum wage earner families. So the Labour Party has continuously highlighted, and does so again tonight in this motion, that 116,000 workers, or 6.6% of the total workforce, already live below the poverty line, and the working poor make up 24% of all those in poverty. Cutting the national minimum wage is also targeting workers who in fact have perhaps the strongest work ethic in this country, Minister. Minimum wage workers get paid a pittance for doing tough, grinding jobs, for example in cleaning, in security, in restaurant services, that many others in the society won't do. In terms of healthcare costs and the medical card, for example, these minimum wage workers would in many cases be better off by not working, and you're in fact giving them that incentive here tonight by your shameful performance on this measure. As the St Vincent de Paul has stated, these are workers, and I quote, who pay for everything and qualify for nothing. Now, many businesses and their representatives also agree that a reduction in the national minimum wage will not enhance competitiveness or create new jobs. The Chief Executive Officer of Retail Excellent Ireland, Mr David Fitzsimons, for example, gave me a briefing recently, he sent it to all of us in fact, and stated that he supports the Labour Party position that a reduction in the national minimum wage is, and I quote his very words in an email to myself, it's not necessary. Indeed, some of the loudest calls for reduction in the minimum wage come from elements within the fast food industry, and that's one of the few sectors that's performing very well and making significant profits in the recession because people are choosing cheaper eating out options. The savage cut in the minimum wage, of course, Laskincorla, contrasts strongly with the ongoing refusal of the government to reform outrageous and unjustified high pay, maximum pay, at the banks, at the semi-state bodies and most of all in the private sector. This week alone we've seen the fiasco in terms of the proposed bonuses at AIB, which my party leader raised this afternoon. But it's grotesque that across the board senior management in an organisation can earn hundreds of times the salary of the lowest paid worker in the same organisation. And as Polly Toynbee long ago noted, the cancer of outrageous pay and bonuses comes directly from the private sector, and especially from financial services. Our sister party, the UK Labour Party, has proposed a new high pay commission, Lascan Corla, to overhaul the dysfunctional compensation system. There should also clearly be a maximum rate for public sector and semi-state salaries, perhaps set at €150,000 maximum. On a number of occasions in the past year, indeed, I've called on Minister Brian Lenihan to establish such a high pay commission for Ireland also, to review all compensation, Minister, across the economy, not just in the public sector, but right across the economy, right throughout the private sector. Of course, a high pay commission that examines and regulates pay in the public and private sectors could be a mechanism for curbing excessive salaries that may discourage dynamic and effective people from leading public sector positions. How long have I left?
Your colleague indicated to let you proceed into her time. So that's what you're doing now.
Okay. Well, I'll just apologise to my colleague and I'll wrap up.
8.5 minutes in the slot.
I'll apologise. And I'll wrap up then, Lascan Corla. In conclusion, the €1 cut in the national minimum wage, it's appalling, shameful, and must, and as our spokesperson has said, will be reversed. It is designed to make the poorest workers in the country bear the brunt of this government's crazy banking policy through an internal devaluation mechanism, which we opposed in this party, these Labour deputies, from day one in September 2008. But the government, as I said, has taken little or no cognizance of the implications for the poorest and lowest income people in this country through their crazy policies. So I commend Deputy Penrose.